Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This is our Shine Remember session, which is an opportunity to think about the members of the Shine community or our friends or family that we've lost, particularly over the last year, but anytime really. And tonight we're really glad we're joined by Richard Cranefield, who is a photographer, and he's also a Shine trustee. And he is going to be telling us a bit about his work, and particularly a project that he's been working on over the last few months, which is photographing people who have lost their partners. So I will hand over to you, Rich, and we'll look forward to hearing.
Thanks, Carmen. I'm just going to see if I can figure out how to share my screen. Very good. Share. And make this big. Where is? There it is. I'm going to try and make you guys smaller so I can see my slides. Okay, so yes, thanks, Carmen. So as Carmen mentioned, I'm a photographer, but also a trustee of Shine, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a project I've been working on for the last year or so, really. The project's called The One I Chose, The One Who Chose Me, because it's a project about grief, but because I'm taking a kind of personal look at it, it's a project about the loss of a spouse. Really, but a lot of I guess the lessons I've learnt about grief would apply just as much to losing a sibling or a son or a daughter or whatever. But this is sort of my photographic journey into grief, and that's me. If anyone wants to contact me, I'm on Instagram, and the project has its own Instagram channel, and there's an email address there. And I live in Surrey, just outside London, with my daughter and well, with my wife, or did, and that's us. And I'm a portrait photographer, amongst other things, but what I really love doing is taking portraits, and this is the style of work that I typically make. It's quite dark and moody, so there's no kind of rolling around looking happy on a white background. There are other photographers that will do that kind of thing. The stuff I make is generally kind of inspired by sort of 16th and 17th century painters like Vermeer and Caravaggio. That's the type of photography I made, and still I started doing a master's degree in photography, which really opened my eyes to how photography could be used to tell stories, and that it wasn't just about taking a nice photo, or even worse, taking a photo of something nice. Which I used to do, and after a while you realize that actually you're not doing anything really as a photographer other than capturing something that's nice and pretty, but you're not bringing anything to it. So in the MA I started making what's called constructed photography, about adolescence and about my daughter's experience of lockdown. The picture on the left here is a kind of remaking of a poster for Henson's Labyrinth, but also sort of borrows from The Wizard of Oz and whatever, sort of that kind of tried to portray her kind of sense of loss in lockdown, and the fact that the rules kept changing, and it was a bit of a maze. And then we started to make some pictures like the one on the right, which was less about lockdown and more about kind of growing up and puberty and body image and that kind of thing. So this was the kind of thing I was making as part of my master's degree, and what I expected to spend 2 years doing. But halfway through the master's, my wife became ill. She had colon cancer, and was diagnosed at the beginning of sort of 2021, although we'd seen some symptoms in late 2020. And things seem to be progressing relatively well, actually, the treatment. I mean, as well as could be, chemotherapy is not fun. Radiotherapy isn't fun. It made her very tired. It was very painful. But we'd actually come sort of summer last year, we'd actually had quite a good report from the Marsden. And then one day in middle of August, she woke up in a lot of pain, which wasn't unusual. And so we went to A&E, which also wasn't unusual. But when we got there, they did some scans and found out that the cancer had spread very rapidly. It was actually Friday the 13th that we went into A&E, and it was the following Friday that she died. And so I was left with a lot of thoughts running around my head whilst being in a state of shock. And I didn't really know where to take the photography. I knew that I wanted to make something about grief because that's all I had. And so I started on this project, really inspired by actually one of the members of Shine Plus Ones that Kaiwen had put me in touch with after a few months after Salma, my wife, had died. Kaiwen put me in touch with someone whose husband had died a few years before from bowel cancer as well. And I just found that talking to her, although our lives and stories were very different, just talking to someone that was further ahead than me was quite comforting. And she recounted a story of having met another widow on holiday who was sort of like 8 years down the line, and how she had found some comfort in that. So I started in my head to sort of kind of imagine this concept of, although we're all on separate journeys and our experiences are very different, as far as grief is concerned, there is some comfort in hearing and seeing people that are further down the road than you, and we're all kind of leading one another along this route. So I started making some work. I decided I would go out and meet some widows that were kind of spread out across a kind of 10-year spread of, I guess, experience at widowhood, if that's such a thing, and try and see if I could see if there was some kind of common narrative or some comfort to be had in hearing these stories. It was very much kind of investigative type thing, of sort of a bit of a voyage of discovery. So there were 3 strands to the project initially. I was taking portraits of people like the one of Joe here on the left. I collaborated with some of the participants of the project in making still lives. So I would ask them to get some artifacts that they still had that reminded them of their spouse, and to deliberately stage them somewhere and take photos of it. And we would talk about how they might stage it. And they would send me photos, and then we'd talk about whether it worked or didn't work. And then they would, if they were generous enough with their time, they would have another crack at it. That's where the picture in the middle came from, that side of the project. And then I was also making my own work, like the piece on the right, which is just a still life of an ornament that Salma and I had bought whilst on holiday in Switzerland. And him and his little partner had stood on our front step for ages, and then the week after she died, he got blown off in a storm, and I found him sort of shattered on the front doorstep, and it seemed the perfect analogy for what I was going through at the time. But the most interesting part of the project for me has been the portraits and the conversations I've had with people. And the way that I kind of structured it was that I would find people through Shine or through Widowed and Young and their Facebook groups, and tell them about the project, and then go and meet them. And unusually for me, I wouldn't take any lights or backdrops. I wouldn't kind of recce the house or place that we were going to meet. I would just turn up with the camera, and we would have a conversation, and then I would try and make a portrait of them that in some way encapsulated or captured an essence of the conversation that we had had. So this is a portrait of someone called Emma. Her husband actually died of COVID quite early on in the pandemic, before any of us really understood quite how serious it was all going to get. He went into hospital, I think it was on the day before her birthday, and then it was some weeks later that she said goodbye to him over Skype. And a lot of the conversations I've had with people have gone on way longer than the sort of half hour or 40 minutes that we sort of planned at the beginning. And people have been very generous with their time and sharing their stories. And it's actually got to a point now where, having shared some of the work and people's stories, I'm now building a backlog of people that also want to be heard, want to have their stories told and shared. One of the first people I met and shot was Steve. He was only 3 months into his grief when we met, and I took this photo of him. I think I was probably about 5 or 6 months. So the two of us were still pretty stunned, in a lot of shock. I like this picture because a lot of our conversation was about having to take on the roles that our wives had primarily done, looking after the kids and cooking and cleaning, and not that, that was just a natural split that we'd kind of fallen into. And he was now having to take on responsibility for that world and, make sure the kids are fed or whatever. And in cinema, green is quite often used to kind of portray an alien environment, and they had this fantastic green splashback in their kitchen. So setting him in the kitchen and surrounded by green to kind of talk about this alien world that he now found himself in really seemed to work for this picture. And we sort of talked a lot about not really, or having to take on all these roles that were kind of a little bit alien to us. It's not that we didn't want to do them, but we were kind of out working most of the time. Another thing that Steve and I talked about, and it was something that I talked about to Terry here as well, who has 3 children, one of which needs near 24-hour care. Both of us, we all talked about our relationship with alcohol, certainly very early on in grief. We had all kind of felt at the end of a tough day, we tried to sort of replicate I've had a hard day after work, and we used to go and sit in the lounge and watch Netflix and have a glass of wine together. And at the end of a day of getting the kids kind of all sorted and dealing with the house and trying to wrap our heads around what was now going on in our lives, we'd kind of sit in front of the TV with a glass of wine, but there wasn't anyone else there to drink the other half of the bottle. So invariably you drink the whole bottle. And so Steve and Terry and me had all kind of decided quite early on that wasn't working, and that we felt we were standing on the edge of quite a slippery slope, and that possibly because we all had kids to look after, that wasn't a slope we wanted to slide down. And so we'd all kind of upped our exercise and had Terry stopped drinking. I think he's drunk twice. I think he said he drank at his 50th birthday, and that's sort of one of 2 occasions where he's drunk since his wife died. It just doesn't work. There's no joy in it. And so, yeah, the relationship with alcohol is something that comes up quite often in some of the conversations that I've had with people, particularly very early on in their grief. And that kind of early period is covered quite interestingly in this book that I read, because I was doing an MA. It included an extraordinary amount of reading as well. Joanne Didion talks about her first year after she lost her husband, and realizing that the behaviors she was exhibiting kind of assumed that he was coming back. Not throwing away clothes, still doing stuff the way that he would have done it, because he might still need them. He might still need his coat or his boots or whatever. And that's something a lot of people have talked to me, and it's only sort of in year 2 that there's a real kind of acknowledgement that, oh yeah, they're not coming back, and I've got to get used to this, which tends to make the second year worse than the first, apparently. I'm just in the beginning of my second year. When I met Burgee, she was sort of just over 2 years in. I met her with her daughter, who is too young to remember her father being anything other than a guy in a photo album with her. I met her with her new partner and their kind of nanny, someone that comes and helps look after her daughter when she's working. And we'd only ever spoken, like we'd exchanged a few messages on Facebook Messenger, and she welcomed me into her home. It was lunchtime. She was like, "You haven't eaten, have you? You haven't eaten. I've made some food," and she'd laid out this lovely spread of sandwiches and stuff. in her kitchen table, and we sat there and the two of us just instantly started talking about very deep stuff, about where she had been, how she had felt early on, where I was. And yeah, we were, chatting for well over an hour. And whilst the other three, her daughter eventually sort of went off to play, the other two adults just sat and watched. And afterwards, she messaged me and said that they'd had this amazing conversation after I'd left, because her new partner and the family friend that was the nanny had never really sat there and had that conversation with her and openly asked her what it felt like, and the struggles she's had and the thoughts she's had, and so it felt like the experience for her of having that conversation with me witnessed was really quite therapeutic for them as a family. One of the things she talked about was kind of holding space for grief when it comes. Lots of the books I've read talk about it coming in waves. Terry, who you saw on the previous slide, actually talks about it coming in tides. It seems to kind of go out for much longer, but then when grief's with you, it hangs around and stays a lot longer too. But Virtue talked about holding space for it and not trying to hide it, and just being in the moment and acknowledging it, and that's how she had got through it, and still continues to get through it. And so when it came to make her portrait, this was in her living room, and there was this beautiful beam of sunlight coming in through the window, and so I got her to sit on this kind of big cushion, and because in my head I wanted to recreate the kind of photos I usually create, and have like a nice light hitting her, but when she sat there, the light just landed on her lap, and I just couldn't figure out how to take a photo of the light being in the right place. And it occurred to me that I had to kind of take on board some of her advice and kind of shift and work with what the world had given us. And so I got her to put, the light was landing on that cushion there, so I got her to lie in a way that meant her face was in the light, and it meant that actually she was in a much more relaxed position and was just kind of eyes closed in the sun, thinking about the conversation that we'd just had. So that the kind of the posture or looks quite relaxed, but actually it wasn't what I would have done ordinarily in photographing someone, but it really summed up her kind of sense that you have to kind of just relax and hold space for the feelings when they come. And she actually coined a term that's become a headline for the project when it's been running. It was published in a magazine last week under the headline, "It will not pass, but it will be okay." And that's something that she said to me almost as we sat down in her kitchen as a piece of advice. And that has, of the many things I've been told in this project, that's one phrase that has really kind of stuck in my head. I met Caroline. She has two children, one that is old enough to remember his father. Her daughter is too young, though. Really, as she grows up, the memory of him being around will fade. This is a photo taken on their upstairs landing in their house. It's a beautiful cottage just outside Oxford that overlooks a graveyard, and you can see his grave from this window. And they walk past it every day on the way to school, which she feels, it wasn't their intent when they bought a pretty cottage next to a graveyard, but it helps keep his memory alive. They talk about Daddy every day as they go to school and as they come home. Her son's very angry about his death, and this all happened in lockdown, so which came as a bit of a double-edged sword, really, because it meant that what help they got was sort of one-to-one, but adjusting to going back to school and dealing with it has been very difficult for them. When I chatted to Caroline, we talked about the things that we end up having to give up, career, ambitions that we may have had, all go by the wayside. And actually the days we have to accept that many things we want to do just don't get done. And that really life revolves around the children and making sure that they're fed and that they're sleeping enough and they've got everything that they need and everything else is subordinate to that. And that's, you know, that's key in any parenting, that the kids are important, but it's just the time that all this takes when you're suddenly a lone parent. And time was something we talked about as well, that you just seem to lose track of time or be out of time. You're not connected to it anymore. And this is something that is also touched on in this beautiful book by Denise Riley, who wrote this essay after the death of her adult son. And it's a beautiful piece of writing. And the whole thing is her talking about how she feels disconnected from time's flow. There's no kind of, you feel like inside you're working in a different, you're either standing still or you're working in a different kind of time base to all of the people that are outside and around you. And there's no, you know, there's a sense of there's no guarantee that tomorrow will come as you'd always predicted it would. You do feel a lot of the time, even though you might be outwardly showing that things are right and you're moving, you're moving on. Actually, inside you're really, there's no link. You feel kind of disconnected from the reality that you knew. This was Gary. This is one of my favorite photos from the series, partly because it was, I love planning stuff, and this was just completely sort of unplanned. We arranged to meet at Embankment Station because that's where he met his wife for their first date. They'd been introduced at a party the night before, got on fantastically well, and decided they'd meet up for lunch the next day. So they met at Embankment Station. And many years after that, got married and had kids. And so that's where we decided we would meet to have our chat. And I got there early and saw a flower stall and thought, oh, that'd be interesting if I got him to like buy some flowers or something. And I really wanted him to buy the sunflowers because Burju had quite a mad experience on the day of her husband's funeral, where she had just suddenly decided in the winter that she must have sunflowers on his coffin. And so was running around all of the supermarkets and florists trying to find sunflowers. And Sam, who isn't in this deck, but was also in the project, has also had an affinity with sunflowers, and they were relevant to her husband. So after Gary and I had chatted in the cafe for just over an hour, we sort of meandered back down towards Embankment Station. And I said, look, do you mind if, you know, if you get some flowers, I get you to, given that you were here to meet your wife for a date, maybe we can do something with that. And I said, but choose whatever you want, but roses might be a bit cliched, so pick something else. And he said, oh, well, we'll choose the sunflowers because that's what we had on my wife's coffin. So I like this image because it's a nod to many, many other widows that are in the project as well, and an acknowledgement of their loss. But also because we found this dilapidated phone box, and Gary and I had talked about kind of how we felt like we now had to be superheroes, trying to do the work of one person, and that we were trying to change our identity. We now had to be the mum as well as the dad, and sometimes you end up actually like almost not channeling them in a spiritual way. I don't mean that we mean it, but just being like them and unlike ourselves, because you know, you're talking to the kids or you're talking to the teachers or whatever, and you behave more like your spouse in that way because that's how they would be. So we talked about kind of changing from one persona to another, and so seeing the phone box made me think of that kind of the motif of superheroes going in there to change from one costume to another. So that's what we used, and it all kind of came together with the sunflowers. Gary was on his way to work. He happened to wear a tie that absolutely matched the sunflowers that neither of us knew he was going to buy. And this dilapidated phone box sort of served the metaphor of us as dilapidated heroes trying to change our identity or come to terms with a new identity. Another thing that Gary said, and I met him the same week that I met Joe here on the right, and both of them, unprompted, came up with the same analogy and said that when they were in a couple, it felt like they were in a band. You presented as a kind of singular entity. You know, it was Rich and Salma. It's, you know, and that's what people expect. And that with the loss of your band member, you know, it's difficult to find the new identity to present to the world and your friends and your family, whatever. And that, you know, it's like going on a solo career and embarking on your first solo album, and but you quite liked being in the old band and you liked the music that your old bandmates played. But this kind of like losing that band identity and that joint identity was something that both Gary and Joe mentioned. And that comes up in a really nice book. Well, it's beautiful. It's, of all of the books I've read, Levels of Life is the one that for me has most captured how I felt and how I feel about grief. It's beautifully written, happens to be about photography at the beginning. But yeah, Julian Barnes sort of says, yeah, you know, he feels less interesting without her. He struggles with social occasions. When he goes to the theatre, he kind of arranges for his friends to meet him outside and rush him to his seat because he can't handle being in a lobby with chatty, happy people. But this, yeah, if I had to recommend one book to read, it would be this, but have a big box of tissues next to you. He's very angry and very bitter, but his writing is just utterly beautiful. And as I said, I've met, you know, people from many stages down their grief journey, and Kirsty was actually the first person I met and photographed for this project. Although this photo is taken from our second meeting. It was taken in the Natural History Museum in London, where her and her husband met when they were working there. And it was down this, they had their first kiss on the museum roof. Isn't that romantic? And it was as she was walking down this corridor at the end of a working day and was taking down her hair that he apparently realized he first loved her. And so we went back there to talk about them, and she sort of showed me around sort of key parts of the museum. And what I like about this image is that one, it's unusual for a portrait and you can't see her face, but I think it really nicely bookends the project, because we saw Steve at the beginning surrounded by this alien environment, surrounded by green and this grief that he's carrying, and Steve clearly looks very shocked, whereas here we see Kirsty, yeah, and the conversation we had, she, you know, she misses her husband and she still thinks about him all the time, but she is genuinely happy with the life that she has and the life that she has made for her 3 kids. She has made friends and had experiences that she would never have had if he hadn't died, and she likes that, although she would give them all up in an instant to have him back, obviously. And that's something that a number of people I've spoken to who are sort of at 7, 8 and 9 years in talk about. They talk about being happy with their lives. But in spite of that, I like this photo because she's still carrying that green bag. The green in the photo compared to the green that surrounded Steve at the beginning is diminished, but it's still something that is carried and that Kirsty deals with every day. This is my stack of books that I went through for this project. Some of the books I've touched on in this presentation are quite deep and angry. There are some oddly unexpected lighter books about grief and loss. Gary Andrews' Finding Joy is a beautiful book. He was a Disney illustrator. He's an actor. He lost his wife to sepsis. And before losing her, he was an illustrator. So every day, at the end of every day, he would just draw a little sketch that summed up how the day had gone and share it on Twitter. And his friends and family would look at it. And then when Joy died, he decided to carry on sketching, and through that gained an enormous Twitter following, and eventually the sketches turned into this book, which is it's really good. It's very touching. And David Grohl's Storyteller book was interesting. That was James, who was a Shine +1. When I asked him, because I asked everyone, is there a book or something that you've read that has helped you or resonated with you on your journey? And James said that it was Dave Grohl's biography that really resonated with him, because he talks about the death of Kurt Cobain, his friend, and the way that Grohl describes his feelings and the sensations made James realize, well, firstly, they sounded a lot like how James felt about the loss of his wife, and it made him realize that maybe as a spouse he wasn't so special, and that maybe his wife's friends felt a lot more the way that he did, that he would have given them credit for. Dave Grohl, I think, had only known Cobain for maybe 3 or 4 years, but they were incredibly good friends. And so I've read the book, and yes, it's interesting to kind of think about how similar our griefs can be, even though the loss may be slightly different. And being Adam Go Lightly was a column, I think in the Times, but I may be wrong. It's a hilarious book about grief, and I didn't expect, I think it was maybe 7 months after Salma had passed away. I was reading it in a hotel room with Emma, because we were on a weekend trip, and I was laughing out loud reading a book about a guy's experience after the loss of his wife. It's odd, but yeah, so there's some interesting reading there, and my website does have a list of all these books if anyone's interested in looking at them. And I've actually started going back through them, because a lot of them I read very early on, and there were bits of them that resonated with where I was then. And so I'm now going back to see if there's anything that I can take from them now. But these are the widows that I've shot so far as part of the project. I have more that are interested, and I'm interested to hear from anyone that would like to be in the project, because I think somewhere in there may be a book, and it's certainly getting some attention from a number of publications and other organizations that are interested in using the stories. Really, grief isn't something that's particularly talked about a great deal, but then there's also, much like the challenges that we see in Shine, of people of working age going through cancer diagnosis, there are similar challenges rather of people of working age going through the bereavement of their spouse, trying to bring up children, trying to keep down a job, finding that the career that you wanted or thought that you had is now an impossibility, and managing all that. And there's also, I've mentioned a couple of people here have new partners, but there is a real difficult discussion to be had for some people about dating and new partners and all that kind of stuff. And when I exhibited this work up in Birmingham in the summer and was talking to people about the project, and some people had seen it, and at least one person said to me that they had seen the project and the stories that were being told within it, and they had used it as a means to have difficult conversations about finding new partners, or not new partners, but finding a new partner, or what that might mean. And they used the project by being able to talk about that and broach that subject in the sort of third person, because they could say, oh, I've seen this project, and there was this, this woman who's 5 years in, and she's got a new husband now, and they're whatever. And by using someone else's story and presenting that as a thing, they could then gauge the reaction, sort of test the water as to how their friends or family might react were they to to embark on a new relationship. So so yeah, that I'm finding a lot of interest, and it's very therapeutic in making the project. But I think there's also a lot of value in sharing other people's stories. So that's it, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Rich. That was amazing. I think we're going to finish the recording now so that we can have a discussion that's not for everyone. But I think that was amazing, and I'm sure that anyone who comes across this video will agree that it was, yeah, there's just a lot of lessons in there for all of us. So thank you very much. I know that Rich, you are a member of Widowed and Young as well, aren't you?
Yes.
So if anyone's looking for support, that's a great place to go. If you are looking for support for the loss of a partner. If you're part of Shine and part of Shine +1s, we tend to have meetups kind of once a quarter for people who are bereaved. So we'd love to see you there as well. Thanks.